I never imagined a simple conversation about household decisions could turn my world upside down. One evening, after 4 months of living together in my apartment, my boyfriend David and I sat down for what I thought would be a calm discussion. Instead, I ended up dialing 911. And no, I didn't expect the police to show up at my own front door. I'm 34, work as a graphic designer, and I've spent the last 8 years carefully building a modest, cozy home that's completely mine. It isn't fancy, but every corner of it carries a piece of me, my work, my style, my routines. After my divorce 3 years ago, having a space that I could truly call my own became essential. David, 38, is a self-employed electrician. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, hit it off instantly, and fell into the kind of whirlwind romance that felt effortless. For the first few months, living together seemed natural. He gradually moved his things into my apartment, and I welcomed him. But somewhere along the way, lines blurred. What started as small disagreements about furniture, groceries, or weekend plans began to feel like control, subtle yet suffocating. That night, it all came to a head. He leaned back in my living room chair, crossed his arms, and said words that made my blood run cold. Either put my name on the house or I'm calling the police. My heart pounded. This was my home. Every mortgage payment, every late night fixing leaks, every single corner of this place was mine. Yet here he was, trying to weaponize the law against me, against my life, my independence, my sanctuary. I froze for a moment, staring at him, realizing the extent of what I was dealing with. 4 months of cohabiting, and suddenly, my boyfriend was demanding joint ownership as a prerequisite for peace. It wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about control, manipulation, and a shocking willingness to turn authority against me. And that's when the thought hit me. I'm about to fight for my home, my dignity, my life. In that instant, I had no idea how quickly this fight would spiral into something that involved the police, my family, and truths about David that would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about him. I didn't know it yet, but my life, my calm, my sense of safety in my own home was about to be completely rewritten. I've always been independent. Growing up, my parents instilled in me a sense of responsibility and self-reliance. I worked part-time jobs through high school, saved every dollar I could, and learned early that the security of having your own space and means was priceless. By the time I turned 26, I had moved into my first apartment, proud of every scrape and dent I had paid for myself. I knew the value of personal effort, of building a life that belonged solely to me. David entered my life at a point when I was finally content with that independence. I'd been divorced for 3 years, and while I had opened my heart cautiously, I wasn't looking for someone to take over my world. I met him at a friend's birthday dinner, the kind of casual gathering where you barely expect sparks, and yet there was something about his easy laugh, the way he noticed small details, that drew me in. He was kind, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in building a connection without rushing anything. Our relationship progressed naturally. We laughed at inside jokes, shared late-night conversations over coffee, and slowly learned each other's habits. I remember the first time he complimented my kitchen. He said he liked how organized everything was, and I felt a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Over time, he started staying over more frequently. At first, it was weekends. Then, gradually, it became midweek nights, weekdays, until he moved his things in, claiming he felt at home with me. I welcomed him because, at the time, everything seemed harmless. Looking back now, there were small signs I chose to ignore. Subtle comments about how I arranged furniture, gentle criticisms about the way I cooked or managed bills, a passing remark about how my home could feel more like ours. I dismissed them as quirks, assuming it was just him adjusting to a new space. My family liked him. They said he seemed steady, responsible, and attentive. My friends liked him too. From the outside, he appeared perfect, a partner who complimented me. And that's what made the eventual unraveling so jarring. Those tiny, seemingly harmless comments were threads in a pattern that only became visible once the fabric started to tear. The trust I had built over months, the careful balance of sharing a home while maintaining my independence, began to feel precarious. What once felt like mutual respect slowly morphed into subtle pressure, little nudges that hinted at a desire for control. Our families had minimal interference, which I appreciated. My parents, before they passed, always told me, choose someone who lifts you up, not someone who demands your world. David seemed to fit that advice initially. I even introduced him to my younger sister, Emily, and she immediately liked him. She commented on how easy it was to talk to him, how patient he seemed. I remember thinking, this is a man I can trust with my heart. Yet, within those 8 months together, the foundation of my trust began to shake. The red flags were subtle, late-night messages I wasn't allowed to see, plans made without consulting me, minor arguments that escalated unexpectedly. I pushed them aside, convincing myself that compromise was part of loving someone. But now, as I stared at him that evening, demanding legal leverage over my home, I realized that compromise had limits, and I was about to cross them. At first, it was so subtle that I almost convinced myself it was nothing. Little things. David rearranging my bookshelves without asking, suggesting we upgrade my furniture, or deciding on a new brand of coffee because it tastes better. On their own, they seemed minor, almost insignificant. But when layered together, they began to form a pattern I could no longer ignore. Friends started noticing the changes too. My best friend Mara once remarked over lunch, "It's like he's slowly moving into your life and taking over, isn't it?" I brushed it off with a laugh, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, sharing a home is supposed to involve compromise, right? But deep down, I felt a flicker of unease every time I watched him navigate my space as if he owned it. The tension escalated gradually. David began inviting his friends over without asking, turning my living room into their social playground. I tried to mention my discomfort. "I'd appreciate a heads up next time you plan to have people over." His response was immediate and defensive. "This is our home now. You're acting like I'm a guest in my own place." I froze, caught off guard. Our home. That phrase echoed in my mind long after the conversation ended. My space, my sanctuary, suddenly felt threatened. Even financial matters started to stir conflict. I covered nearly everything, the rent, utilities, groceries, while David contributed only sporadically to his bills. When I gently suggested that we discuss a more equitable division, he countered with a casual, almost dismissive remark, "I improve the place, don't I? Isn't that my contribution?" The audacity of it struck me. My own home, my money, and yet I was being questioned for wanting fairness. There were also subtle emotional manipulations. He'd make comments about my personality, my choices, or even my friends, framed as concern. "Are you sure you want to spend the weekend with Mara? I think we could do something together instead." On days when I challenged him, he would retreat, sulking, giving me the silent treatment, only to emerge later with the same charm that had initially drawn me in. The push and pull created confusion, a constant emotional roller coaster. I started reflecting on our early months together, recalling small incidents that now felt ominous in hindsight. The first time he questioned how I managed my finances, the subtle digs at my decisions, the occasional condescending tone, things I had laughed off, convinced they were trivial. But now a pattern of control, subtle yet insistent, was emerging. I realized that compromise was being used as a guise to exert power, and I had unknowingly allowed the first signs to slide. Family dynamics added another layer. My parents' warnings echoed in my head. Pay attention to how he treats your boundaries. Though they were gone, their voices lived in me, cautioning me that what might seem like harmless behavior could evolve into something more manipulative. My younger sister Emily noticed it too. During one phone call, she hesitated before saying, "Are you sure he's being fair to you? You seem stressed every time I talk to you about him." I brushed it off, unwilling to admit that the unease I felt daily was valid, that I was slowly losing control over my own life. And yet, there was still love. Despite these red flags, I cared for him deeply. I wanted to believe in our relationship, to trust that the man I fell for would respect me, my home, and my independence. But the seeds of conflict had been planted. Every controlling suggestion, every dismissive remark, every small encroachment on my boundaries was watering them. And I knew, deep in my gut, that if left unchecked, these seeds would grow into something dangerous. It all came to a head one Tuesday evening, the kind of night that starts quietly but ends with your world shattering. David had just told me that his book club, 8 Women I Didn't Know, would begin meeting in my living room every Tuesday from now on. I felt a rush of disbelief and panic. Wait, you're what? You didn't even ask me. My voice trembled, though I tried to stay firm. My heart raced, my palms slick with sweat. This was my sanctuary, the place I had built and maintained for years. Suddenly, I felt like an intruder in my own home. He leaned back casually, his expression unreadable. I already told them we'd host. It'll be good for you to be more social. Every instinct in me screamed that this was not about socializing. It was about control. My chest tightened as anger and fear collided. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. 8 women I don't even know taking over my living room every week? Don't you think that's something we should discuss first? His response was chilling in its simplicity. Why would I need permission to have friends over? This is my house. My name is on the deed. You moved in 4 months ago. I froze, my blood running cold. The words were factual, true in their surface logic, yet beneath them lay an implication that made my stomach knot. He was trying to leverage my home, my legal right, against me emotionally. I felt trapped. My pulse pounded in my ears, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Well, maybe it's time we made it official then, he said, his voice deceptively calm. Either I'm your partner with equal say in decisions, or I'm just some woman you're shacking up with. The room spun. 4 months of cohabitation, and suddenly he was demanding joint control of my home, my finances, my life together, as a prerequisite for basic respect. I felt my chest tighten, my throat dry. My heart hammered like a drum in my rib cage, and I realized this was no ordinary argument. It was a threat. I tried to reason, my voice steadier than I felt. I think we should slow down on big decisions and work on communication first. Commitment can't be forced with ultimatums. His face hardened. You never had any intention of building a real future with me. You just wanted someone to play house until you got bored. You're wasting my time. Every word hit like a physical blow. I could feel the sting of betrayal, the sharp ache of disbelief. I had cared for him, trusted him, shared my life, and now my sense of safety and home was under siege. I tried to explain calmly, wanting to discuss major life decisions isn't the same as rejecting you. This isn't about me holding back, it's about respecting the life I've built. But he wouldn't hear it. If you don't want me here as an equal partner, then I don't want to be here at all. My body trembled with a mix of rage and fear. I should have walked away, let him pack, let the argument end. Instead, I tried to de-escalate, suggesting we both take time to cool off. That was my mistake. 2 days of silent treatment followed, during which he dramatically packed his things, though he never actually left. It was all performance, a demonstration of control. By Tuesday evening, his book club arrived as planned, ignoring my presence and boundaries. I'm not canceling my commitments because you're being unreasonable, he snapped when I questioned him. The tension in the room became unbearable. I retreated to my home office, heart racing, hands shaking, trying to collect my thoughts. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I was no longer arguing over furniture or coffee brands. This was about control, manipulation, and a willingness to weaponize authority, my home, my life, against me. When I returned later that night, the living room was empty except for him. His eyes, cold and determined, met mine. We need to settle this tonight, he said. Either you commit to treating me like an equal partner, or I'm leaving for good. I felt a tight knot of dread and disbelief. My heart pounded in my chest. My home, my sanctuary, had become the battleground. I realized then, with chilling clarity, that this confrontation would define everything that came next. I sank into the couch, my hands trembling, my mind racing faster than I could control. The adrenaline that had surged when David had laid down his ultimatum was now replaced by a heavy, sinking dread. My home, my sanctuary, the place that had always been my safe harbor, suddenly felt like a cage. Each familiar corner seemed foreign, invaded by his demands and manipulations. My chest ached with a mix of fear and anger, and tears threatened to spill as I tried to process the surreal turn of events. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, searching for a moment I could have said something different, something that might have prevented this spiral. Did I ignore the signs? I whispered to myself. Was I too accommodating, too trusting? The questions spun in an endless loop. Every gesture, every compromise I had made over the past 4 months suddenly felt like it had been taken for granted, twisted into leverage against me. I thought about my past relationships, how I had always tried to meet my partner halfway, to smooth over conflicts and prioritize connection over confrontation. I prided myself on being patient and understanding, believing that communication and empathy could bridge any gap. But now, faced with David's blatant disregard for my boundaries, I felt a gnawing fear that my empathy had been mistaken for weakness. For hours, I sat in silence, my thoughts racing. I pictured my parents, gone now, whose voices had once guided me through challenges. You raised yourself to be independent, to protect what's yours, I imagined them saying. Their advice had been clear. Boundaries were not optional. Respect was non-negotiable. And yet, here I was, hesitating, paralyzed by disbelief and shock, unsure how to assert control over my own life. Eventually, I knew I had to act. I couldn't let fear dictate my next steps. I stood, pacing the apartment, my mind mapping out options and consequences. Calling the police seemed extreme, yet his threat to weaponize authority against me made it necessary to prepare for the worst. My heart thumped painfully in my chest as I considered the reality. Someone I loved could so casually try to manipulate the legal system to gain control over me. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would explain the situation. Each sentence I whispered to myself carried the weight of the stakes involved: my independence, my safety, my reputation. The emotional roller coaster left me exhausted. Fear, anger, betrayal, confusion, all coalescing into a strange clarity. I realized that this was no longer about compromise. This was about self-preservation. I thought about confronting him directly, about standing firm in my home and asserting that his demands were unreasonable, manipulative, and unacceptable. But even the thought of a face-to-face confrontation made my stomach twist. How do you fight someone who knows how to play the system? I wondered. My mind returned again to the nights of small manipulations, the subtle encroachments on my life, and the moments I had brushed off discomfort for the sake of harmony. The truth was undeniable. This pattern had been there all along, growing under the guise of compromise. And then, a quiet resolve began to settle in. Fear remained, yes, but it was joined by a spark of determination. I would not be steamrolled. I would not surrender my home, my independence, or my dignity. I would act decisively, but rationally. My pulse still raced, my hands shook, yet I could feel the beginnings of clarity, the understanding that boundaries were my right, and that standing up for them was an act of strength, not confrontation. Before facing him again, I took a deep breath, grounding myself. I reminded myself that being firm didn't mean being cruel, that protecting myself didn't mean abandoning compassion. I knew the next conversation would be tense, possibly explosive, but I also knew that hesitation could cost me everything. I had to face the reality. This wasn't just a disagreement about furniture or schedules. It was a test of my autonomy, my sense of self, and my willingness to protect what I had built. And for the first time that night, I felt a flicker of control, a reminder that even in the storm, I had the power to shape my response. The following week felt like living in a storm with no shelter. Every morning, I woke with a knot in my stomach, anticipating the next confrontation. David had escalated the situation beyond anything I could have imagined. His friends and even some of my mutual acquaintances seemed to sense the tension and, unintentionally or not, took sides. The weight of social pressure pressed down on me, amplifying the fear and frustration that churned in my chest. It started with small provocations. David would make comments about how I overreacted or misunderstood his intentions whenever I questioned a decision or suggested we talk before inviting friends over. The words stung, but what hurt more was the insidious tone, the implication that I was irrational, that my voice didn't matter. He painted me as the obstacle to harmony, the problem that needed to be managed rather than a partner with valid concerns. Family dynamics complicated everything further. Though I had no immediate family in town, David's extended family began weighing in. Text messages and comments came with veiled suggestions that I should learn to compromise or trust him. At first, I tried to ignore it, but their subtle interventions began to feel like orchestrated pressure. It was no longer just about David's demands. It was an entire network nudging me towards surrender, questioning my judgment, and undermining my confidence. Meanwhile, new evidence of his controlling behavior emerged. I found that he had been keeping a separate log of household expenses in which he unilaterally decided how much I should contribute. He had also invited a few friends over to survey the house and suggest rearrangements without consulting me. Each discovery felt like a fresh violation, a reminder that my autonomy was being eroded inch by inch. I felt cornered, my home transforming into a stage for someone else's power play. One evening, as the tension reached a boiling point, a particularly heated argument erupted over something seemingly trivial, the placement of a lamp in the living room. His voice rose sharply, accusations spilling out faster than I could respond. "You never consider how I feel. This is ridiculous," he shouted. My chest tightened, my throat raw from trying to speak calmly, my hands gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. I responded with as much composure as I could muster. "David, it's not about not considering your feelings. It's about discussing changes before they happen. This is my home too, and I deserve respect for that." His laughter, sharp and mocking, cut through me. "Respect? You've lived here 4 months. You act like you're entitled to everything, but you don't even know what commitment means." I felt my patience snap, but I kept my voice measured. I realized that yelling would only give him the satisfaction of control. Instead, I focused on facts, my voice steady despite the heat in my chest. Commitment doesn't mean surrendering my home, my finances, or my independence. Respecting boundaries is part of any real relationship, not a threat to it. The argument spiraled for hours, punctuated by silent treatments, slammed doors, and a growing sense of dread that he would escalate even further. During the moments of quiet, I would sit alone in my bedroom, heart racing, trying to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the person controlling my life. The dissonance was jarring, each memory of tenderness now tainted with the shadow of manipulation. Yet, amidst the chaos, something within me shifted. I noticed a subtle change in my own thinking, a move from fear-driven reactions to strategic awareness. I began documenting everything: conversations, threats, incidents, even the subtle ways he tried to manipulate others to support him. My hands shook as I wrote at first, the adrenaline making every word feel heavy, but slowly, the act of recording became empowering. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't at the mercy of his whims. I had evidence, a lifeline of truth in a sea of false narratives. During one particularly intense confrontation, when he accused me of overreacting to nothing, I looked him in the eye and said firmly, "This isn't nothing. This is my life, my home, and I will not let it be manipulated or taken from me." For the first time, I noticed a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. The smirk faded, replaced by a fleeting uncertainty, a crack in his armor of control. It was the first time I realized that asserting myself didn't escalate the situation. It challenged it. I was no longer reacting out of fear or confusion. I was acting with clarity, refusing to let intimidation dictate my life. Each documented incident, each firm boundary, was a step toward reclaiming my power, even as the external chaos intensified. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. Tension hung in every room, unspoken accusations and simmering resentment filling the air like smoke. I felt exhausted, emotionally drained, but also strangely resolute. I knew that the next confrontation would either break me or allow me to take control, and deep down I felt ready to fight, not with fists, but with truth, evidence, and an unwavering sense of self-worth. By the time Friday night arrived, the house felt like a cage. Every room, every corner, every familiar object seemed tainted by the chaos of the week. I walked through the living room, past the rearranged furniture, past the piles of books and mugs that weren't mine, and felt a deep, sinking despair. The place I had built with care, the sanctuary I had clung to after my last divorce, had become a battlefield. I sat alone in the bedroom, the weight of isolation pressing down on me. My chest felt tight, my breath short, as if the very walls were closing in. Every plan I had made, every dream I had nurtured for a peaceful home, seemed to crumble in the wake of David's relentless control. I questioned everything, my judgment, my trust, even my own strength. "How did I let it get this far?" I whispered to the empty room. The loneliness was suffocating. Friends tried to check in, but I found myself withdrawing, unable to articulate the mess of emotions swirling inside me. The silent treatment, the constant manipulation, and the looming threat of legal action had left me feeling powerless. Each time I looked at my phone, I half expected another demand, another threat, another attempt to assert control over my life. I thought about leaving, but the thought was paralyzing. My home was mine, legally, physically, but emotionally, it felt claimed by someone else. The power he wielded wasn't just over the space, it was over my peace of mind, my sense of safety, and my identity. Even the idea of packing a bag and leaving seemed impossible, as if abandoning my sanctuary would mean admitting defeat. The fear of what might happen next gnawed at me. He had already threatened to call the police, to weaponize the law against me. What if he followed through? What if my reputation, my freedom, my life were put at risk because I had dared to assert boundaries? The thought of false accusations, of my name dragged through gossip and legal documents, made my stomach churn and my hands shake. Tears streamed down my face, silent and unrelenting. I felt both anger and helplessness, a paradoxical mix that left me hollow. Every betrayal, every manipulation, every dismissive remark replayed in my mind, amplifying the despair. I had invested trust, love, and care into this relationship, and yet I was confronted with the stark reality that affection alone couldn't protect me from someone willing to exploit my kindness. Even in my darkest moments, though, a small spark remained, the faint awareness that this situation was not a reflection of my worth. I realized that the crushing weight of fear and betrayal didn't have to define me, but that awareness was fragile, flickering against the storm of anxiety and self-doubt. My heart raced with panic, my mind spun with what-ifs, and the silence of the house became deafening. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the emptiness press against me. For the first time in months, I confronted the truth. I was at the breaking point. I could continue to absorb the manipulation, the ultimatums, and the encroachment on my life, or I could act. The problem was, I didn't yet know how. The fear of retaliation, the threat of false accusations, and the overwhelming sense of isolation made each choice feel impossible. Hours passed. The night deepened. I stared at the ceiling, tears drying on my cheeks, and whispered to myself, I need to find a way out. I need to survive this, and I will. The words were barely audible, fragile, yet they carried a seed of resolve. I understood in that moment that the lowest point wasn't just despair, it was the prelude to awakening. Though I was broken, scared, and exhausted, I knew something fundamental. This storm, no matter how fierce, would not define me forever. I had reached the darkest point, and that meant the only way forward was through it. I felt the first stirrings of determination, faint but insistent, pushing against the oppressive weight of fear. Saturday morning broke quietly, almost mockingly serene compared to the chaos of the previous week. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee untouched, staring at the piles of documents and notes I had been meticulously collecting, screenshots of messages, lists of uninvited guests, records of his threats and ultimatums. The weight of evidence finally gave me something tangible, a lifeline in the storm. As I sifted through the papers, a strange clarity began to emerge. Every escalating demand, every passive-aggressive comment, every silent treatment, it all formed a pattern. He hadn't just been difficult or controlling. He had been methodically trying to dominate, to leverage fear and intimidation to bend my will. And now for the first time I could see it clearly, and it terrified him. I remembered a conversation from a week ago, a mutual friend casually mentioning, sometimes people manipulate situations, but evidence speaks louder than words. Those words, offhand and almost dismissed at the time, now resonated deeply. This wasn't about compromise or negotiation, it was about standing up for myself, about reclaiming control. I knew I needed reinforcement, someone neutral to validate my perspective. I called my brother, Hunter, who I trusted implicitly, even if it had been a while since we had dealt with anything of this magnitude together. Within minutes, he arrived, eyes sharp, posture alert. Just his presence brought a strange sense of protection, as if the walls of the house themselves acknowledged that I wasn't alone anymore. I laid out the evidence calmly, explaining each incident, each threat, and every attempt to manipulate my life. Hunter listened, taking notes, his expression unreadable at first, then gradually darkening with concern. She's been trying to control your life, your home, and even your legal standing," he said quietly. If this were anyone else, it could have gotten out of hand quickly. Hearing it articulated by someone objective shifted something inside me. My fear began to transform into determination. I realized that this wasn't a personal failing or a flaw in my judgment. It was a confrontation with someone who had chosen to manipulate and dominate. My response now would define not just the immediate situation, but my future sense of safety and self-respect. I took a deep breath and felt the first true stirrings of empowerment in days. This wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine, my autonomy, my home, my dignity. Hunter's presence, his calm and professional approach, gave me the courage to see beyond the immediate chaos and imagine a resolution where I retained control without compromising my principles. By late afternoon, I had made my decision. I would not be coerced into unequal partnership or financial control under duress. I would confront David one last time, armed with evidence and clarity to set boundaries definitively. My hands no longer shook with fear. They gripped the edge of the table with purpose. My heartbeat, though still rapid, carried excitement and resolve rather than panic. When I finally stood to face him, I felt a strange serenity. I looked him in the eye, no longer the confused, fearful woman from days past. "David," I began, voice steady, "this isn't about compromise anymore. I've documented everything. Your threats, your ultimatums, your attempts to manipulate my home and my life. They end now. I will not be bullied, coerced, or intimidated into something I don't agree to." The moment hung heavy in the air. I could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes, perhaps even doubt. I felt my own fear dissipate, replaced by a quiet power, the knowledge that I had prepared, documented, and fortified myself mentally and emotionally. I wasn't reacting blindly anymore. I was responding with purpose. Hunter's presence reinforced my strength. He didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. I had allies, evidence, and the clarity of my own convictions. For the first time since the week began, I felt in control, unafraid of the storm. The turning point wasn't just in confronting David, it was in reclaiming my self-worth, recognizing my right to safety, respect, and autonomy. That night, as I finally felt the first calm in days, I understood something fundamental. Empowerment comes not from forcing others to change, but from standing unwaveringly in your own truth. I had reached the moment where fear was replaced by clarity, helplessness by agency, despair by determination. And in that clarity, I knew the next steps would be decisive, measured, and completely mine. The next few days unfolded like the aftermath of a storm, leaving David exposed and isolated, while I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. Once Hunter had helped me confront him and document everything, the dominoes began to fall naturally. The tension that had gripped the house for weeks shifted, and suddenly, the world around David reflected the consequences of his choices. First, the social fallout was immediate. Friends and acquaintances who had once admired him or taken his side began to see the cracks in his carefully constructed image. Word spread quickly about the incidents, the threats, the false accusations, and the manipulations. The same network that had subtly pressured me now began to distance themselves from him. Invitations that had once flowed freely to his social circle vanished, replaced by cautious whispers and awkward excuses. I felt no satisfaction in watching it happen, only relief that the truth was finally recognized. Within the house, the atmosphere changed almost overnight. David, previously confident and domineering, now moved with hesitation, his usual bluster replaced by a cautious edge. I no longer felt the weight of intimidation pressing down on me. Instead, the space I had built, my sanctuary, my home, felt like mine again. Each familiar object, each corner I had arranged with care, regained its rightful meaning. Hunter stayed nearby, professional and supportive, helping me navigate the legal and logistical consequences. Cassidy, or rather, David, had attempted to use threats and ultimatums as weapons, but Hunter's intervention ensured that justice, not fear, prevailed. The police report, which had once been a tool of coercion against me, now became a symbol of accountability. The false report would not stand, and the law had recognized the severity of the attempt to manipulate it. Interestingly, David's family began to reevaluate their stance. The subtle pressure they had exerted to push me towards surrender shifted as the truth emerged. Once I shared the documented evidence and the timeline of events with select family members, their quiet disapproval of his behavior became clear. The narrative they had been primed to believe, his version of control and victimhood, crumbled under the weight of facts. It was an uncomfortable but necessary reckoning for him, as even his closest allies had to confront the reality of his actions. In the quiet of my home, I felt an unexpected serenity. I moved through the rooms, reclaiming them with deliberate intention. I adjusted the furniture, organized the kitchen, and reinstated routines that had been disrupted. Each action, no matter how small, reaffirmed my autonomy. I wasn't acting out of spite or vengeance. I was restoring balance, reclaiming the life and space that had always been mine. When David finally moved out, it was anticlimactic yet significant. No dramatic confrontation, no further accusations, just a quiet packing of belongings and a final, tension-filled exchange. I watched him leave, not with anger, but with a profound understanding. Some people reveal themselves through their choices, and their actions, not our reactions, determine the outcome. I felt no need for revenge. The truth had already done the work. The broader community began to notice too. Those who had witnessed bits of the drama, neighbors who had heard arguments or seen the tension in the household, now understood the real story. Misplaced sympathy shifted, and David's credibility suffered. What he had attempted to control through manipulation and coercion had instead highlighted his recklessness and poor judgment. His reputation, carefully curated over years, faltered under the scrutiny of honesty and transparency. I spent time reflecting on the lessons embedded in the experience. Standing firm, documenting evidence, and seeking support when necessary were not just practical strategies, they were affirmations of self-worth. I realized that the peace I had longed for was not simply a matter of quiet, but of asserting my boundaries and ensuring they were respected. The ability to reclaim space, both physical and emotional, became a source of empowerment. Hunter's support remained invaluable. Beyond legal advice, he offered perspective, validation, and a sense of security I had not realized I craved. His presence reminded me that standing up for oneself does not mean standing alone, and in that realization I found a deeper understanding of resilience, not just surviving, but reclaiming strength and clarity after manipulation and betrayal. By the end of the week, my home was truly mine again. The quiet, once a backdrop to tension and fear, now felt like freedom. Every decision, from the way I arranged furniture to how I planned my day, was an affirmation of agency. The space I had fought for was no longer contested. I could breathe without hesitation, move without apprehension, and live without compromise forced by manipulation. The fallout had been swift, but it was not cruel. David's isolation, the social consequences, the loss of credibility, these were natural outcomes of his own choices. I had done nothing to orchestrate them beyond standing firm, documenting, and asserting my rights. In the end, the universe, it seemed, had a way of balancing the scales without my interference. The house was quiet again, truly quiet this time. The chaos of the past week felt like a distant storm, leaving only the calm clarity of reclaimed space. I walked through each room, noting the little details I had missed in the whirlwind. Sunlight filtering through the curtains, the hum of the refrigerator, the familiar creak of the floorboards. For the first time in months, I felt at home. It wasn't just about the physical space, it was about the emotional and mental territory I had reclaimed. I had faced manipulation, threats, and false accusations, and emerged not just intact, but stronger. I realized that self-respect and boundaries weren't negotiable. They were non-negotiable pillars of any relationship and any life I wanted to lead. I thought about David and what had happened. There was no bitterness in me, only recognition. Some people reveal themselves in ways that make their true nature unavoidable. I didn't need to punish him. The consequences of his actions had already unfolded naturally. Justice, accountability, and truth had their own power. Hunter visited later that week just to check in. We shared coffee and conversation, lighter now, with no tension. "You handled everything with clarity and courage," he said. "Most people would have crumbled under that pressure. You stood your ground." His words resonated deeply. I understood now that being strong didn't mean being unfeeling. It meant protecting yourself, asserting your rights, and refusing to let fear dictate your life. I reflected on what I had learned, not just about relationships, but about myself. True partnership doesn't involve coercion, control, or ultimatums. It involves mutual respect, honesty, and shared values. Someone who respects you will never try to manipulate your safety, your home, or your trust. And sometimes the lesson is that the courage to walk away is as vital as the courage to fight for what's right. As I settled into the quiet of my restored home, I felt a renewed sense of freedom. Decisions were mine alone, but the confidence I had regained was even more valuable. I knew that moving forward, I would be more cautious, more discerning, but also more empowered to demand the respect and partnership I deserved. To anyone watching this story, my message is clear. Value yourself, trust your instincts, and never let anyone manipulate your boundaries. Good relationships should lift you up, make life simpler, and add peace, not fear or constant negotiation. Your home, your life, and your dignity are yours to protect. I took a deep breath, smiled at the sunlight streaming through the window, and finally felt the peace that had been missing for far too long. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Reclaiming yourself is the most powerful story you will ever tell.